Hello everyone. This video lesson is for forced migration, part of the population unit. There are two migration case studies that you need to be aware of. One of them is the voluntary migration case study, which is about the movement of Mexican people over the border into the USA. The second case study is a forced migration case study, and for that we will discuss Syria. There is obviously a really important difference between forced and voluntary migration. And we'll look at, first of all, what a definition of forced migration is. Then we'll look at the exam questions, which are basically what are the causes of forced migration? What are its push and pull factors? That's the really key information you need to focus on. And secondly, what are the impacts of a forced migration that you've studied on its people, for example. So the case study that we will focus on throughout is Syria. It's a really good, current, up-to-date example of a forced migration. So what is a forced migration? Well, I'll let you read this for yourself. But basically, it is when somebody is made to, compelled to, or forced to move from their home, either within their country or to another country for reasons that are beyond their control. So good examples would be shortage of food, natural or human-induced disaster. Warfare, of course, is a driver of forced migration. But also persecution is an example of migration, where people seek to flee a government that perhaps persecutes them for their religious choices or for their sexual orientation, or because of their ethnicity. These are all reasons why people might be forced or feel that they are forced to move from their home, take their family and move to another place. And throughout history, sadly, there have been lots of examples of forced migrations. For example, the Jews fleeing Nazi Germany, that's an example of a forced migration. The Rohingya Muslims fleeing northern Myanmar just in the last 10 years. And those are two examples of many examples that have happened at either end of the 20th century. It shows that this is still a current and ongoing issue that we've yet to really find resolutions to. So it's a really important thing to understand. So our case study is in Syria. Now, here's where your notes really need to begin, okay? You do need to have an understanding and a detailed understanding of your case study. So here's a brief rundown of what happened in Syria, how we got to the point where people felt that they had to migrate. This is a simplified breakdown, I should stress that. In 2011, protests took place after some school children were arrested and reportedly they had their human rights abused, and this was all because they'd written anti-government slogans on a wall. The protests initially were calm and peaceful, but for reasons which I think it would be difficult to give real clarity to, the situation did not improve, and soldiers opened fire on the protesters, and they killed 4 people. This sparked a kind of cycle of tit-for-tat violence between different groups of people within Syria, especially within the settlement of Deraa, where this was taking place. And mourners at the funerals of the 4 people were shot at the funeral, and another person was killed. Now, this really did then shock and anger a lot of people, and this led to unrest, which spread to other parts of the country and started to trigger the civil war that took place. Um, Initially, um, the people who were protesting in the streets were motivated by cries for freedom, greater freedom of speech, greater religious freedom, and a more true version of democracy, as the president Bashar al-Assad um, had largely moved away from true democratic um, electoral procedures. They demanded that Bashar al-Assad resign, but he refused to step down. And this then led to people entrenching themselves. That means digging themselves in. I don't mean that literally. I mean people grouped together with like-minded people within their communities and decided that they needed to defend their position, and whether that be a physical position or a political one. And that's where you lead to civil war. Now, do your own research. You'll find that depending on which historian you're reading and which political analyst you're reading, there are different versions of what happened in Syria. It's a very complex and still changing situation, but that gives you a brief understanding of how we got to the point where there was fighting in the streets. These men are not army, as you can see by their equipment and their dress. They're civilians, but nonetheless, there was this violence in the streets caused a complete shutdown of the urban areas where this violence was taking place. You saw the lives of children being dramatically affected because of all of that. Schools couldn't function. Many schools were turned into makeshift hospitals, emergency shelters for people whose homes had been destroyed. Sanitation and disease became commonplace. Shortages of water and food also affected the lives of children living across Syria. Many people started to flee the violence, and these images I'm sure you will have seen in your lifetime of people trying to cross into Turkey or other islands in the Mediterranean by boat, and sometimes leading to tragic consequences. This kind of thing became more common as people tried to flee the violence, protect their children, protect their families from the cycle of violence that was taking place between the president's army and between various groups of people who were protesting. And as you can see in this map, there's like the different colors are representative of the different interest groups. Now, this map is dated 2017. And it shows you the grey area represents ISIS-controlled areas. Now, it's important to realize, of course, this situation has completely changed since 2017. But it just illustrates for you how many different interest groups there are, how many different religious or ethnic or political groups there were with different allegiances and loyalties, all of whom were unhappy in some way with the situation, the government in Syria at the time, and that's a key ingredient to lead to civil war. Now that we are in a situation where we've at least briefly understood how we've arrived at a situation of civil war in Syria, what we need to answer now are the SQA's two questions. One, what are the factors that are driving civilians, Syrian civilians and families to leave their home, their lifetime home, uplift their belongings and flee to another place? Those are called push factors. And what things are drawing them towards other places? Those are known as pull factors. Once we have looked at that, then we need to understand the impacts upon Syria and the impacts upon the country to which the refugees are going. On this map, you can see the kind of numbers of forced migrants we're talking about. A forced migrant and the term refugee are very similar. Now, we need to understand, first of all, what is pushing these hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, in fact, over the border from Syria into other countries. Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey are the countries most affected by these migrations, but other countries have been involved, of course, including our own. It's useful for you to know a couple of these statistics because it really allows you to give good case study detail in your answers. Don't forget that you need to have good quality case study detail in your answers. Right, so what are the push and pull factors? The first push factor is that since March 2011, there's been civil war in the country and that it is, of course, a dangerous place to live. And that pushes you to leave your home. Near 500,000 deaths have been recorded, and that, therefore, of course, is probably a conservative estimate. And that is a thing that will drive you to flee your home. You're worried for your family, you're worried for your children. Because of the destruction and disruption, basic healthcare services are unavailable. So if you happen to be pregnant, just as one scenario, if you happen to be a mother who is pregnant, then you're going to be highly motivated to flee, to be a forced migrant, because 40% of the population can't access basic health services, and you're about to have a baby. So there's one example. Or maybe you have another pressing health condition, but in that scenario where nearly half of the population cannot get to see a doctor, what are you going to do if you are seriously ill or in need of medical attention? Put yourselves in that situation and you'll begin to understand what has been happening to millions of people in Syria since 2011. That's a decade of your lives, by the way. Of the 113 public hospitals that did exist, 60% or just under are either completely destroyed, some of them having actually been targeted by government forces because they had been giving medical care without bias. That means that they've been giving medical care to anybody that turned up. It doesn't matter whose side you're on. And Bashar al-Assad actually passed a law that banned that, and that led to some of the hospitals being put out of action. But the main thing to know here is that a lot of the hospitals are damaged or out of service. Because the economy is completely collapsed because of the fighting and the violence, half of the population are unemployed. That's astonishing. This means that no businesses are functioning. This means that basic daily essentials aren't available. How are you going to keep your family fed and clothed and warm if only 1 in 2 of the population have a job? So for many families, this was a really important driver. They can't make any money, and therefore they can't afford to keep their families safe. And as a result of, I suppose, that, nearly 3/4 of the population are living in extreme poverty. You have to understand that Syria was not a desperately poor country. Syria had reasonable levels of development. I'm not pretending that it had a perfect human rights record or that it had the same level of healthcare and education provision as Finland and Norway. But nonetheless, Syria, the population of Syria had access to a high-calorie diet, good healthcare, an education system, and a reasonably reliable, peaceful sense of law and order. I think would be the most generous way I could put it. But For that country within a 9-year period to go from that relatively prosperous picture to 50% of people being unemployed and 70 living in extreme poverty, that's an incredibly quick turnaround, and it of course forces large numbers of people to, because they have no option, to locate to a different place just so they can keep their families warm and healthy. So what about the countries, the neighboring countries, Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan? Well, Syrians, of course, the Syrian families have relatives in nearby countries. Um, I'm sure many of you have relatives who live in nearby countries to Scotland. And it makes sense then that this was a pull factor. People were attracted to go and live in Jordan because they had cousins in Jordan, or they had, a sister or an aunt or whatever. And that family connection is what drew them to that country. Also, the border with Turkey, Lebanon and Jordan, most famously Turkey, is very big. It's a long border, and it's not like there's a border wall or a fence or even checkpoints on all of the roads, which makes it a very porous border. That means that you can pass over it quite easily. And that makes it relatively easy to migrate into those countries if you don't happen to have all the necessary paperwork. Um, there are other pull factors, but those pull factors tend to be less relevant to this case study. For example, you might find that some countries are open to people who have ethnicity, religious background, or sexual orientation that isn't acceptable in their home country. And that would be a pull factor to draw those people to that country. But in this scenario, in the Syrian case study, we're talking about people's health, well-being, and safety as the main drivers, pushing them away from Syria and pulling them towards Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. Make sure you've got a note of all of these, as it will be an important. This is absolutely core notes for this unit. So that brings us on to the second and final question of this unit of work, which is what are the impacts on the donor country? And what are the impacts on the receiving country? When you use the term donor country, and it's important you understand the term because the SQA question might use this term, we're talking about the country that is donating people, I suppose is where the word comes from. What that means is this: Syria is the donor country. Syria is giving people. Of course, that's not an accurate description. These people are fleeing for their lives, but nonetheless, Syria is the donor country. It's the country that's giving up people, and we need to understand how that forced migration of people away from Syria is affecting Syria. What the impacts are. Okay, so first of all, there's something called a brain drain. Remember, if it's got an orange background, it's definitely notes, and you should copy it down. You can read the statistics on the screen for yourself, but basically, the most educated elite professionals in Syria, for example, let's say surgeons and doctors, not only are they going to have the money necessary to flee in a civil war situation, because of course, in that situation, you would need to have access to someone who can get you a passport, perhaps, or someone who can provide you transport. And people who are wealthier are more able to flee, but also they have skills that are more in demand abroad, and they can literally seek employment in other countries where others cannot, and this leads to a brain drain. Where the most able and professional people quickly leave the country. This means that, of course, Syria is left where they've hardly got any doctors, they've hardly got any surgeons, and they're in a situation where civil war is ongoing, which is a real disaster. Mass homelessness is another key impact. According to the UN, 6.5 million people are internally displaced within Syria. Let's not forget that. Yes, some millions of people have fled over the borders into other countries because they are fleeing violence. But 6.5 million people are homeless within their own country. Um, so that's another really saddening impact. As I mentioned, they just don't have enough doctors, largely because of the brain drain. Um, they don't have enough doctors and nurses to look after the injured and weak. This is an excellent case study here. The non-discriminatory healthcare. Non-discriminatory healthcare is basically when it doesn't matter whose side you're on, but if you turn up to the hospital will treat you because that's what doctors do. They don't judge you for who you are or what you've done. They just repair you. Um, so the provision of non-discriminatory healthcare was criminalized by the government of President Bashar al-Assad under the Counter-Terrorism Law 19. That would be the case study you probably want to take a note of. What this means is providing healthcare in opposition-held areas. Obviously, that would be Bashar al-Assad's definition of opposition-held areas, is defined as material support for terrorism and therefore punishable under law. And that just makes it even more difficult for Syria, the remaining doctors and nurses in Syria, to deliver the healthcare that's needed. Cities such as Homs and Aleppo, these were vibrant, beautiful cities. Many areas were more modern and perhaps not quite so beautiful, but they both have really architecturally and historically significant town centres. They are ancient cities. They've been there for thousands of years. They're beautiful places. And they're now, as you can see in the picture, just devastated. Ghost towns. There are no services, there are no supplies, there's electricity will not be regular, and no, there won't be rubbish collection or anything like that. These cities really are absolutely devastated places. They're unsafe to be in, and you can understand just by looking at that picture, if that's what had happened to your city, your entire city, you'd be forced to leave. You wouldn't have an option about it. It's not because you want to, it's because you're forced to, and that's the whole point. Cities, I've mentioned there are things about electricity and rubbish collection, but there are, of course, much more important aspects of infrastructure that are destroyed. Roads, railways, ports, all are important things because they allow Syria to import food and medical supplies. But I've decided to focus on schools, which are another key element of infrastructure. And you can see where schools in this map have either been destroyed or used as shelters, so that the children aren't getting an education. Now, remember, this crisis began in 2011, and we're now 2021. That's a long time. That's multiple generations, in fact, of children in Syria who will not have received anything like the basic education they should have, and that's going to have an impact upon Syria's future economy, on its ability to recover from this crisis. Life expectancies are impacted, not of course just by war and the dangers that warfare presents, but also shortages of necessities like food, clean water, and medical care. So, what are the impacts on the receiving countries? Remember, our case studies there are Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. First of all, some towns bordering on the Syrian border have seen their populations double. This puts a huge pressure on Turkey or Lebanon's health and education services. Those children that cross the border, they need to go to school in some form or another, and of course, lots of people will require healthcare. Where people can't get into a town and find actual accommodation, refugee camps grow. Refugee camps are often supported by the local government. It is in everybody's interest that there's somebody organising a refugee camp. There's somebody in charge and somebody planning them. The problem is that the refugee camps grew too fast for the Lebanese or the Turkish or the Jordanian government to keep up. And you can see here in this picture how waste management at the camps just, well, it wasn't manageable. And that, of course, can lead to the spread of disease. This is an example of the kind of schooling that's set up for refugee children. You can see it's basically a tent. Even though this is in the Middle East, temperatures are not always warm, I should hasten to add, and I can imagine it would be really uncomfortable for those kids. Now, you can see here that in Lebanon, for example, they've had to teach the Lebanese children, they've had to send Lebanese children home at lunchtime and teach the Syrian children for the second half of the day. They've found ways to adapt. But clearly there's too much strain placed upon the local education system. That's the main point you want to make. This is a famous and very, very saddening picture. This is Aylan Kurdi. That's the name of the little boy who, as a toddler, was washed ashore after trying to escape into Turkey. I use this powerful image to illustrate the fact that that neither Syria nor Turkey want this situation, and both are overwhelmed by their circumstances. Syria is, of course, convulsed in civil war, which this poor child's family were trying to flee. Turkey is overwhelmed by the humanitarian crisis and isn't able to provide the level of support necessary. That's not a reflection on, I don't think that needs to be a reflection particularly on Turkey. It's a reflection on the humanitarian crisis and the global response, if anything. So very, very sad. Further to that, there was an international response, of course, to the Syrian crisis. As you can see, this is dated 2015. The conflict began in 2011, and governments around the world were reticent. They were not keen to involve themselves in the conflict in a military level for various political reasons. But the Aylan Kurdi incident, that's the little boy I've just shown you a picture for, did trigger more of a humanitarian response, as you can see here in this headline. And Britain is a good example of how a receiving country was impacted, because it then started making places available for Syrian refugees, a fifth of whom are settled in Scotland. And those Syrian refugees contribute towards the Scottish economy. They bring their own skills, they bring their own work ethic, and they pay their taxes, and they contribute towards the economy of the country that they are in. And that's a really important impact upon the receiving country. There are some negative viewpoints. Some Lebanese people say they've lost their jobs because Syrians are willing to work for less money. I would always caution that in this kind of scenario, if you are a homeless Syrian person, I don't think you can be blamed for trying to get whatever employment you can. And if that means working for less money, then that's a decision you're likely to make. Remember to always question which Lebanese employers are employing Syrian people for less money. And it's the employer that needs to be tackled, not the refugee, not the migrant. But nonetheless, there is a view in some countries neighbouring to Syria that people are losing their jobs because of this influx of people who are desperate for employment to support their families. In this map here, you can see where there are concentrated refugee populations in Turkey. And this can bring cultural tensions where different ethnicities are forced to mix, different religious backgrounds to become neighbors. That can create resentment. Also, it can lead to urban areas. Any of these city names will suffice as a case study. It can lead to them becoming overcrowded, and it can lead to the price of renting a property to go up. So that's the end of the forced migration case study. You'll probably want to run this a couple of times and make sure that you've got the notes. The notes to focus on are the push and pull factors and the impacts on the donor country, which is Syria, and the receiving countries. There's not that many questions you can be asked, which is good news for this section. You can see the questions on the screen right in front of you. There are only 2 questions. What are the push and pull factors and what are the impacts on the donor or receiving country? But what you will need to know is the case study detail. Make sure that you have named examples, named towns, named cities, facts and figures. The 6.5 million displaced people within Syria, that kind of knowledge is necessary. So that's why it's really important you rewatch these videos and you take the notes from these videos and then reproduce them in your answers in class.